When I saw the eviction notice taped to my door, my hands trembled, not from surprise, but from the realization that I had no plan left. No savings. No job. No one to call. My boyfriend's words still echoed in my head, "I can't keep bailing you out." I stared at the paper, its bold letters blurring as my vision clouded. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was the final push off the ledge I'd been clinging to for weeks. I pulled it off gently, as if handling it with care would somehow soften its impact. My legs felt heavy as I walked inside, where the silence swallowed me whole. I sat on the edge of the couch, holding the letter like a confession. My chest ached, not just from fear, but from shame. Shame that I had let it come to this. That I was no longer the woman who had it all under control. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message. Not from work, not from a friend. Just another rent reminder from the system. I stared at the screen and whispered to myself, 3 months ago, I made a decision I can't undo. And everything changed because of it. Let me tell you exactly how it all happened. But before I share this secret I've carried for so long, tell me, have you ever kept a truth hidden so deep, you started to forget it was there? And when it finally came to light, did it break everything or just reveal what was already broken? It started with the pink slip. The envelope was small and cold in my hand, the kind that delivers news without ceremony. I stood by the copier when they called me in, pretending to read a report I didn't understand, as if staying busy could shield me from what I already knew. When I sat across from the HR manager, she didn't look me in the eye. She said words like downsizing, nothing personal, and thank you for your years of service, and I nodded, numb, my thoughts already skipping ahead to bills, groceries, and the rent due in 2 weeks. I didn't cry. Not then. I smiled, packed my things into the box they gave me, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. What was there to say? I was invisible to most of them anyway. My desk cleared, my ID badge turned in, and my worth reduced to a severance check that wouldn't last a month. When I got home, I placed the box gently by the wall and sat on the kitchen stool, staring at the calendar. My boyfriend would be home in 3 hours. 3 hours to figure out how to tell him, or how not to. He'd been distant lately, working late, distracted, critical in subtle ways. Did you really spend that much on groceries? Or maybe don't nap during the day if you're so tired at night. I hadn't told him how I'd been skipping lunch to save money, or how I sometimes just sat in the bathroom at work to breathe. I made coffee I didn't want and opened the fridge. The light buzzed and flickered, exposing emptiness, half a lemon, a bottle of mustard, 2 eggs. I closed it again. No plan. No job. Rent in 2 weeks. I walked into the bedroom, pulled the blankets over my legs, and stared at the ceiling. The walls felt closer than usual. When he came home, I watched him from the hallway as he kicked off his shoes, loosened his tie, and scrolled through his phone. I waited for the right moment, after he finished his drink, after he sat down, after he asked how my day was. But he didn't ask. He turned on the TV, and I sat beside him, pretending nothing had changed. When he reached for the remote, our hands brushed. He didn't look at me. Did something happen at work? I asked finally, my voice thinner than I intended. He sighed. Just the usual. Deadlines, idiots, the usual. I nodded. A beat passed. I wanted to talk to you about something. He raised a hand without looking away from the screen. Babe, not now. Please. I've got a migraine coming. And that was that. The next morning, I pretended I was going in. I dressed as usual, packed a lunch, and walked out the door. I sat on a bench at the park for hours, watching strangers pass, wondering if they could see through me. A woman my age walked by in a sharp blazer, her heels tapping the pavement like declarations. I shrank into my coat. Later, I stopped by the building office to ask if there was any way to extend my rent deadline. The girl behind the glass gave me a rehearsed smile and pointed to the posted policy: "We can't make exceptions." That night, I opened the cabinet where we kept the wine and poured the last of it into a chipped glass. I drank slowly, thinking maybe the fog in my head would lift if I just allowed myself to sink deeper. I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed everything: my boss's flat voice, the manager's detached condolences, my boyfriend's migraine excuse. I was still awake when I heard someone knock on the door the next afternoon. I thought it might be a delivery, but there was no package in sight. When I opened it, I saw him, the landlord. He was taller than I remembered, in a plain jacket and dark jeans, holding a folder in his hand. "Afternoon," he said, nodding politely. "Just checking in on the rent situation." I stood awkwardly in the doorway, blocking his view inside. I'm working on it. Things are a little tight." He didn't press. He only nodded again. "I understand. Look, I don't want to rush you. But I do have to file paperwork if payment isn't received within the week." My cheeks flushed. "I'm not trying to skip out. I just lost my job 2 days ago." He looked at me for a long moment. Not judging, not pitying. Just seeing. "That's tough," he said finally. "I've seen it happen more times than I can count lately." I said nothing. "If you ever want to talk through options," he added, tapping the folder, "let me know. I'm not a monster. Just doing my job." "Thanks," I muttered, barely above a whisper. I closed the door and leaned against it, pressing my palm to my forehead. My pulse throbbed behind my eyes. The notice came the next morning. Official, printed, taped directly to the wood. I stared at it until the words stopped making sense. Then I peeled it off slowly and sat on the floor with it. That's when I knew this wasn't going away. I didn't have money. I didn't have support. And the one person I thought would help me had already checked out. This was the moment. The one you don't see coming until it swallows you whole. And I still hadn't made a choice. But something in me already had. The day after the notice arrived, I sat in the kitchen long past sunrise, fingers curled tightly around a chipped mug filled with water. Not coffee, I couldn't afford to waste the last few scoops left. I stared at the peeling edges of the eviction letter on the counter like it might suddenly disappear if I looked long enough. The sun poured through the window, but it brought no warmth, only a cruel clarity that highlighted every flaw in the walls, every pile of unpaid bills, every reminder that things were unraveling faster than I could catch them. He came home late that evening. I heard the door click open, his keys jingle, and the thud of his shoes landing lazily near the threshold. He didn't call out my name. Instead, he went straight to the fridge, sighed, then opened the cupboard. I listened to the silence stretch, heavy and full. It was the kind of silence that filled a room when two people had stopped expecting anything from each other. He entered the kitchen a few minutes later, holding a takeout bag. The smell of greasy noodles filled the room. He didn't offer me any. I didn't ask. I finally cleared my throat. "I need to talk to you." He didn't look up. "Can it wait until after I eat?" "No," I said. My voice surprised even me. "It can't." His eyes met mine then, tired and a little impatient. I took a breath, fingers tightening around the mug again. "I lost my job. Last week." He blinked. "What?" "I've been pretending. Leaving in the morning. Sitting in the park. Looking for jobs, but nothing's come through." He set the food down. "Why wouldn't you tell me?" I swallowed hard. I was scared. I didn't want you to think I was failing. He ran a hand over his face. And now what? You want me to cover the rent again? Is that it? I couldn't speak. The answer was yes. But not just that. I wanted him to care. I wanted him to put his arm around me, tell me we'd figure it out, tell me I wasn't alone. But the only thing he did was shake his head. I told you last time. I can't keep fixing things for you. He walked out of the kitchen, and the sound of the television filled the silence again. I sat there for another hour. Something in me shut down that night. Not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. I had asked for help. I had exposed my vulnerability. And it had been met with indifference. The next morning, I didn't pretend to leave for work. I stayed in bed, watching the dust dance in the morning light. My phone buzzed with yet another reminder about the rent. I turned it face down. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. I hadn't been expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and saw the landlord again, holding the same folder. When I opened the door, he stepped back politely. Sorry to bother you again. I folded my arms. It's fine. He hesitated. I know it's uncomfortable, but I just wanted to check in. I can give you a few more days if that helps. I looked down. It doesn't. I don't know what to do. He nodded slowly. I get it. It's not easy right now. A lot of people are stuck. I leaned against the doorframe, the tension in my shoulders unbearable. I've been applying to everything. Cleaning jobs. Reception work. No one's calling. He looked at me carefully. You want to come in for a minute? We can talk. No pressure. I didn't answer. But after a few seconds, I stepped aside and let him in. We sat across from each other in the living room. I pulled my sleeves down over my wrists, suddenly aware of every wrinkle in my clothes. He didn't seem uncomfortable. He looked around, calm, like he wasn't there to collect money, but just to be present. I know what it's like, he said after a pause. To feel like the ground's giving way. To not know who to turn to. I studied his face. It was quiet. Unreadable, but not unkind. Why are you being so nice? I asked. He shrugged. Because life's hard enough. And I've been there too. Something softened in me. I didn't cry. But something cracked, like an old floorboard under too much weight. We sat in silence for a while. There was no awkwardness. Just stillness. Like two people standing in the same storm, not speaking, but understanding it was the same rain soaking them both. He stood to leave. If you need anything, someone to talk to, help with paperwork, whatever. Let me know. Thank you, I said quietly. As he reached the door, I stepped forward. And we kissed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't delicate. It was raw. Desperate. Like two people grabbing onto something, anything, to remind themselves they still existed. That there was still some kind of warmth in a world that had gone so cold. When he pulled away, neither of us said a word. He left quietly, and I closed the door behind him. I stood there for a long time, forehead against the wood, heart pounding like it was trying to escape me. My lips still burned, not from passion, but from the sudden realization that I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. But it wasn't regret I felt. It was something else. Something more dangerous. Relief. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay on the couch with the lights off, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of traffic. My mind played the scene over and over. The softness of his voice. The weight of the silence. The kiss that wasn't supposed to happen. In the quiet, I found myself thinking, maybe I wasn't looking for a solution. Maybe I was just looking to be seen. And somehow, in that one moment, I had been. But the shame came later. The guilt. The fear of what this meant. Not just for my relationship, but for who I was becoming. And yet, even through the fog of all that emotion, one truth remained: I didn't feel invisible anymore. And that, more than anything, terrified me. The morning light was brutal. It poured through the thin curtains like an interrogation, exposing every cracked surface, every smudged windowpane, and every unspoken truth from the night before. I hadn't slept. I don't even remember lying down. I just moved from room to room, touching things absently, the chipped rim of a plate, the frayed edge of a dish towel, as if grounding myself through objects might undo the weight sitting in my chest. My lips still tingled from the kiss. Not because of how it felt, but because of what it meant. I had crossed something. A threshold. And though no one knew, I did. That was enough. I boiled water for tea I didn't want, watched the steam rise, then disappear into the still air. The silence was different now. Not empty. Loaded. It carried a charge, a vibration beneath it. As if the walls were listening. When I heard the key in the lock, my body tensed. My boyfriend came in, carrying a grocery bag. I stood in the kitchen, unsure whether to greet him or pretend I wasn't there. He saw me and paused, as if calculating how much energy the conversation would require. "I grabbed some eggs," he said flatly. "And bread." I nodded. "Thanks." He placed the bag on the counter and opened the fridge, not noticing, or pretending not to notice, the eviction notice still folded and sitting beside the toaster. It had been there for days. I left it visible on purpose. He didn't ask about it. We moved around each other like pieces of furniture, sharing space, never truly connecting. I watched as he filled his cup with orange juice and scrolled through his phone with his other hand. I waited. For a question. A glance. A crack in the indifference. Nothing. That afternoon, I walked to the community job board near the local library. The corkboard was cluttered with faded flyers, babysitting gigs, tutoring, cleaning houses, part-time data entry. I scribbled down numbers, though I already knew most of them by heart. I had called them before. I would call again. This time, maybe someone would answer. I sat on the steps outside the building, looking at my notes, the wind picking at the edges of the paper. The world moved on around me, mothers wrangling toddlers, students with backpacks, an old man feeding pigeons. Everyone seemed to have somewhere to go, something to do. I had nowhere. I didn't even want to go home. So I didn't. I walked. I wandered past a laundromat, a closed bakery, a vacant shop with dusty windows. I let my feet choose the direction. Eventually, I found myself in front of his building. The Landlord's. I didn't plan it. But once I was there, I couldn't make myself leave. The door was slightly open, a wedge of cardboard keeping it from closing fully. I pushed it gently, stepped inside. The hallway smelled like fresh paint and something faintly citrusy. I hesitated at the foot of the stairs. I didn't know what I was doing. Then he appeared. At the top of the staircase, holding a paint roller and a tray. His sleeves were rolled up, specks of white dotting his forearms. He looked surprised, but not displeased. "Hey." I cleared my throat. "Sorry. I was just passing by." He set the tray down on the step. "Want to come in? You can sit for a bit." I didn't answer. Just climbed the stairs, slowly, carefully, as if each step might collapse beneath me. His apartment was warm, modest, cluttered in a lived-in kind of way. A book on the coffee table. A jacket draped over the back of a chair. It felt like someone's life, unpolished, real. I sat on the edge of the couch while he went to wash the paint from his hands. I stared at the wall across from me. A painting hung slightly crooked, something abstract, blues and grays blending into each other like smoke. When he returned, he handed me a glass of water. I accepted it, though I wasn't thirsty. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon," he said, sitting across from me. I shrugged. "I didn't expect to come." He nodded slowly. "But you did." I looked at him. "I don't know why." He leaned back in the chair, exhaling through his nose. "Maybe you just needed a place to breathe." That sentence undid something in me. My eyes welled, but I blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. I didn't want to be the woman who cried on someone's couch. I wanted to be the woman who figured things out. But I wasn't. Not today. We sat there in silence. The kind that wasn't awkward, just heavy with everything we weren't saying. He didn't push. He didn't offer solutions or ask questions that might corner me. He just existed in the space, like an anchor. Eventually, I stood. "I should go." He didn't move to stop me. "Okay." At the door, I hesitated. "Thank you. For yesterday." He gave a small nod. "You don't have to thank me." I walked home slower than usual. The air had turned colder. I wrapped my coat tighter around me, not from the wind, but from the confusion that had taken root deep inside. Back at my apartment, my boyfriend was gone. His keys were still on the hook, but his jacket wasn't. I didn't ask where he had gone when he returned later that night. He didn't offer the information. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the television flickering between channels. I watched him through the corner of my eye, the slope of his shoulders, the way he absent-mindedly scratched his chin, the way he didn't look at me. He was here, but not really. I tried to remember the last time he had touched me without prompting. The last time he had asked me how I felt. The last time I had felt like I mattered in his world. I couldn't. And now someone else had looked at me like I was visible. Someone else had seen the cracks and hadn't turned away. That thought both comforted and terrified me. I went to bed early that night, pulling the covers up to my chin, facing the wall. I heard him brush his teeth, turn off the lights, settle into bed beside me. The mattress shifted. His breathing slowed. I stayed awake long after. In the dark, I placed a hand over my heart, half hoping it would be racing from guilt. But it wasn't. It beat steady. Calm. I didn't know what that meant. Only that everything had started to change. The following days stretched like thin fabric pulled too tight. Every hour seemed to pass with a slow tension, as if time itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. I went through the motions, making breakfast, checking job boards, folding laundry, but I wasn't really present. My body moved, but my thoughts wandered endlessly, circling the same questions: what had I done, what did it mean, and what came next? I hadn't seen the landlord since the day I walked to his building. That absence should have brought relief, but instead it left a void. Not seeing him made it worse somehow. Like something unresolved was sitting just outside the frame of my life, waiting to be acknowledged. My boyfriend and I barely spoke. He left early in the morning and returned late. When he did come home, he seemed even more withdrawn than usual. He didn't ask how my job search was going, didn't comment on the growing pile of unopened mail on the table. We existed in parallel silence, like strangers boarding the same train but headed for different destinations. On a rainy Thursday, I sat on the living room floor, surrounded by unpaid bills and half-filled job applications. I was supposed to call 2 cleaning agencies that afternoon, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I stared at the numbers, at the carefully printed instructions, and felt the familiar weight pressing down on my chest. That's when my phone buzzed. A message. Not from a friend or recruiter. From him. Asterisk, I'm repainting the hallway in Unit C. If you're around and want to help, you're welcome to. No pressure. Asterisk. I stared at the screen. The message was simple, casual, without expectation. But the invitation hung there, tempting. I didn't answer immediately. I sat with it for a while, letting the quiet pulse of curiosity grow. An hour later, I found myself standing outside Unit C, the door propped open slightly by a paint can. I knocked lightly before stepping in. He looked up from where he was crouched on the floor, stirring a tray of paint. You came, he said simply. I nodded. I had time. He handed me a brush without ceremony. We worked side by side in silence, dipping and brushing long strokes along the wall. The air smelled of fresh paint and damp wood. Occasionally, our arms would brush, or we'd step back at the same time to examine the work. But there was no tension. Just presence. Just doing. At one point, he turned to me and said, "You don't have to do everything alone, you know." I paused, brush in hand. The words struck somewhere deep. I'm used to it, I said. He didn't argue. He just nodded, as if he understood the kind of silence that teaches a person to rely on themselves. We worked until the wall was covered in a soft, calming gray. Not perfect, but clean. Clear. When we finished, he offered me water and we sat on the steps outside the unit, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the rhythmic drip of rain from the rooftop. I glanced at him. Why did you invite me today? He tilted his head. Because you looked like someone who needed a task, not a lecture. I smiled slightly. You're not wrong. When I returned home, the apartment felt smaller than before. The air was heavier, the colors duller. My boyfriend was on the couch, watching something loud and fast-paced. He didn't look up when I walked in. Where were you? He asked, eyes still on the screen. Painting, I replied, setting my bag down. Painting? Helping the landlord. He didn't respond. Just shifted in his seat. I went into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter, staring at my reflection in the dark windowpane. I looked older than I remembered. Tired. But something in my eyes looked different. Not better. Just awake. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how easy it had been to breathe beside someone who didn't need anything from me. Someone who simply offered space and let me fill it however I needed. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. It was just quiet. The next morning, I opened my closet and saw my work clothes still hanging neatly. Blazers that hadn't been worn in weeks, shoes that no longer felt like mine. I touched one of the jackets, running my hand over the fabric. It felt foreign now, like a costume I used to wear. Instead, I pulled on jeans and an old sweater and headed out. I walked without a clear destination again, past the familiar streets, past the corner market, past the place where the sidewalk cracked in the shape of a lightning bolt. I found myself sitting on a bench outside the bus stop, watching people go about their days. I saw women my age in office attire, laughing with colleagues, balancing coffee cups and tote bags. For a moment, I wondered what they saw when they looked at me, if they looked at all. By early afternoon, I returned home. The mail had arrived. Another notice from the property management company. I sat at the table, staring at the envelope without opening it. I already knew what it would say. Another reminder. Another warning. Another countdown. But this time, instead of panicking, I stood up, took a deep breath, and walked out the door. I didn't go far. Just down the hall. I knocked once before stepping back. He opened the door. No surprise in his face. Just calm. I think I need a place to stay, I said. He didn't blink. Okay. And just like that, something shifted. It wasn't an escape. It wasn't a rescue. It was something quieter. A choice. A step. I didn't bring anything with me but a small bag and my keys. I didn't explain. He didn't ask. He showed me the spare room, a small space with plain white walls and a clean bed. There was a desk in the corner, a reading lamp, a chair. It smelled of lemon cleaner and something faintly familiar. Safety. I can pay rent, I said quickly. Just give me a little time. He nodded. Take what you need. Later that evening, I sat at the desk with my laptop, reworking my resume for the 10th time. I added things I had forgotten I could do, skills that had been buried beneath years of routine and smallness. I sent out 3 applications before closing the lid. From the hallway, I could hear him humming quietly as he made tea. The sound was soft, low, comforting. It didn't demand anything. It just existed. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was falling. I felt like I had landed somewhere. Not quite home. But close enough to start again. The days that followed blurred together in a quiet, muted rhythm. I tried to convince myself that this was temporary, that the spare room, the silent understanding, the borrowed space were just a bridge. A moment of pause before I returned to something stable. But the truth was, I had no clear idea of what stable looked like anymore. The room was small but clean. Every morning I folded the blanket neatly, wiped the desk surface, opened the window even when it was cold. I needed the air, the sense of movement. Outside, the city kept moving, distant car horns, dogs barking, someone playing music on a portable speaker down the block. Inside, it was still. A kind of stillness I hadn't realized I craved. I spent most of my time job searching. The corner of the room had become my workspace, with my laptop, a notepad, and a coffee mug that I rinsed after every use. I submitted applications relentlessly, retail, reception, part-time admin roles. I tailored cover letters, revised bullet points, polished sentences that promised dedication and professionalism. No one responded. At first, I pretended it didn't bother me. I told myself that the market was slow, that I just needed to keep trying. But with each passing day, the silence in my inbox felt heavier. Each "we regret to inform you" chipped away at something I wasn't sure I could rebuild. I didn't see much of him during the day. He was often out, checking on tenants, handling repairs, delivering papers to the office. But I noticed little things. A note left by the coffee pot, "There's soup in the fridge." A folded blanket left on the couch after I'd fallen asleep reading. A quiet knock on the door in the evening with a cup of tea I hadn't asked for. We didn't talk about the kiss. Not once. It hung in the space between us, neither acknowledged nor avoided. Just present. One afternoon, I went for a walk to clear my head. The cold air bit at my cheeks, but it felt good to move. I wandered without purpose, passing closed storefronts and people rushing with their coats drawn tight. I ended up at the park near the edge of the neighborhood, a small green patch with weathered benches and bare trees. I sat for a while, hands tucked into my sleeves, watching 2 kids kick a half-deflated ball across the grass. I thought about the woman I used to be. The one who planned meals in advance, who color-coded her calendar, who knew the passwords to every account. That woman would have never let things unravel. She would have never slept in someone else's home, too ashamed to call it refuge. But I wasn't that woman anymore. And maybe I never really had been. When I returned that evening, the apartment was quiet. I took off my shoes, hung up my coat, and headed toward the kitchen to heat up whatever was left from lunch. But as I passed the living room, I saw him there, sitting on the edge of the couch with a stack of papers in his hand. He looked up when I entered. "Hey," he said. "I was just going over some tenant forms." I nodded. "Busy day?" He shrugged. "Steady." I hovered near the doorway. "Do you mind if I sit?" "Of course not." I crossed the room and sank into the chair opposite him. The silence between us was comfortable now, less fragile than it had been in the beginning. It felt like two people coexisting, not just occupying the same space. After a while, I spoke. "I got another rejection today." He looked up. "I'm sorry. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I've worked my whole life. I've done everything right. And now I can't even get a call back." He didn't offer advice or sympathy. Instead, he set the papers aside and leaned forward slightly. "You're not doing anything wrong. You're just in a moment that's asking more from you than usual." The words landed softly but deeply. I nodded, eyes stinging. "It's hard not to feel like I'm failing." "You're not failing," he said. "You're adapting." That night, after dinner, we stood side by side at the kitchen sink, washing dishes without saying much. It was quiet, ordinary, the kind of intimacy that doesn't announce itself. I handed him a plate to dry, and our fingers brushed. We paused, just for a second. The space between us shifted, charged with something unspoken. He turned to me, eyes searching, not asking, just seeing. We kissed. We kissed. There was no build-up, no hesitation. Just a moment suspended in silence and breath, and the quiet truth of two people reaching across the divide. When we parted, I didn't pull away immediately. I stayed close, feeling the warmth between us, the steady rhythm of his breathing. There were no words. None were needed. Afterward, I returned to my room. I closed the door gently, sat on the edge of the bed, and let the quiet wrap around me. My reflection in the window showed a face I barely recognized, softened, tired, but more alive than it had been in months. I thought I would feel guilt, shame, fear. But I didn't. I felt still. And in that stillness, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: choice. Not obligation. Not desperation. Just the quiet power of choosing something for myself. I knew the road ahead wasn't clean. I hadn't made sense of what any of this meant. I didn't know how long I'd stay here, what would happen next, or how to explain any of it to the person waiting in my old apartment with all his silences and expectations. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to face what came next. Because for once, I had stopped pretending. And started living. I woke up early the next morning, before the city had fully stirred, before any sound had returned to the streets below. The air in the room was cool, almost still. For a few seconds, I lay perfectly motionless, my body warm beneath the blanket, my mind calm. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was close enough to make me hesitate before moving. Then the thoughts began. Not regrets, those hadn't come yet, but questions. Quiet ones, persistent ones. What now? What does this mean? What have I just made real? I sat up slowly, rubbed my face, and pulled the sweater from the back of the chair. I didn't want to overthink. Not yet. I wanted to hold on to the simplicity of the previous night for just a little longer. In the kitchen, I boiled water and made tea. I moved quietly, aware that he might still be sleeping. The apartment was silent, but not heavy. More like a pause in a sentence, waiting to see what came next. I sat at the small table, hands wrapped around the mug, watching steam rise. I tried not to imagine him in the other room. I tried not to replay the kiss. But of course I did. Every second of it. Not because it had been dramatic or sweeping, but because it hadn't been. It had been human, grounded, real. And that was what unsettled me the most. Later that morning, I took a long walk. I needed space, not from him, but from the version of myself that had crossed into something new and unfamiliar. I walked aimlessly, following cracked sidewalks and quiet alleys, letting my body move while my mind wandered. I ended up near my old building. I don't know what pulled me there, habit, maybe, or the need to see what I had stepped away from. I stood across the street and looked up at the window I used to stare out of. The curtains were drawn. There was no movement. The building looked the same, and yet everything had shifted. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message. It was from him. Asterisk, hope you're okay. Take your time. Asterisk. Simple. Thoughtful. No pressure. My chest ached in a way I couldn't quite name. When I returned later that afternoon, the apartment smelled of something warm. He was in the kitchen, stirring a pot on the stove. The air carried notes of garlic and something slightly sweet. He looked up when I entered. You walked far, he said. I nodded. I needed to clear my head. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer reassurances. He just handed me a bowl when it was ready and motioned to the table. We sat together in silence, eating slowly. It was a quiet meal, not solemn, but introspective. At one point, I looked up. I don't know what this is. Or what I'm doing. He met my eyes. You don't have to. Not today. I nodded, grateful for the space. The rest of the evening passed without complication. He worked in the living room while I answered emails and tweaked my resume again. I received a message from a local office asking if I could come in for a short-term filing job. It wasn't permanent and it didn't pay well, but it was something. I replied yes immediately, then sat back and closed my eyes for a few seconds. A small step, but in the right direction. The following morning, I dressed carefully and left for the assignment. The office was small and cluttered, a two-person team with boxes of paperwork piled high. I sorted files, labeled folders, and listened to the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. It was tedious work, but it gave my hands something to do and my mind a break from its constant circling. By the end of the week, they asked if I could stay for a few more days. I agreed. The money wouldn't solve anything long-term, but it gave me enough to breathe. Enough to contribute. When I returned to the apartment that Friday evening, I placed a small envelope of cash on the kitchen counter. For rent, I said. He didn't argue. He only nodded, tucked it into the drawer, and went back to chopping vegetables. It was that kind of interaction between us, simple, direct, respectful. There was no pretending that we were more than what we were, but also no effort to undo what had already happened. That night, I found myself sitting by the window long after he had gone to sleep. I watched the city in the distance, tiny lights flickering in apartment windows, shadows moving behind curtains. I wondered how many of those people were living versions of the story I had fallen into, quiet unravelings, silent choices, steps taken without knowing where they'd lead. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes in myself. I stood a little straighter. I spoke with more clarity. I laughed once while reading a ridiculous typo in a work memo, and it felt real. I didn't feel healed, but I felt awake. The apartment grew familiar, not just in its layout, but in its rhythm. I knew which floorboard creaked near the hallway, how long the shower took to warm up, which window let in the best morning light. These were not my walls, but they held me kindly. Then, one afternoon, I received a message from my old boyfriend. Just a single line. Asterisk, we need to talk. Asterisk. I stared at it for a long time. There had been no communication since I left. Not a call. Not a knock. And now, this. I didn't respond. Not right away. I let it sit. I went into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I thought about the weight of that sentence. We need to talk. About what? About absence? About silence? About something broken long before I ever stepped out the door? He messaged again 2 hours later. Asterisk, I'll be home Saturday. I'll leave the key under the mat if you want to get your things. Asterisk. There it was. Final. Clean. I took a breath, then finally replied. Asterisk, I'll come by Sunday. Thank you. Asterisk. I told the landlord later that night. Not with an announcement, just in passing. I'll go pick up some of my things on Sunday. He nodded. You want a ride? No, I said. I need to do this alone. He didn't push. He just handed me a folded blanket from the couch and said goodnight. That night, I didn't lie awake. I slept. Deep and dreamless. Because something had settled in me. Something that wasn't fear or confusion. It was acceptance. Not of what had happened, but of what would come next. The sky was overcast on Sunday, as if the day itself had decided to mirror my hesitation. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual that morning, brushing my hair with slow, deliberate strokes, unsure of why I even cared about how I looked. It wasn't like anyone there would notice. Or maybe it wasn't about them at all. Maybe it was about control over something, anything. I hadn't been back to that apartment since the day I left. Since I folded up my past and set it on pause. The landlord didn't ask if I needed help carrying things. He didn't remind me to call if I needed a ride. He just placed a thermos of coffee on the counter as I tied my scarf and gave me a quiet nod as I headed out. That gesture, simple as it was, stayed with me as I walked the several blocks in silence, the warm metal pressing through my gloves. When I reached the building, it felt smaller than I remembered. Less like a home and more like a box that once fit me, now too tight around the edges. I stood on the front steps for a moment, staring at the door, at the crack in the wall beside it I used to ignore. The key was where he said it would be, under the mat, tucked into a plastic sandwich bag, dry and untouched. Inside, the air was stale. Dust hung in corners. The hallway rug was crooked, as if someone had kicked it in passing and never bothered to straighten it. I closed the door behind me softly, as though entering someone else's life. Maybe in some way, I was. My things were still there, mostly untouched. He hadn't thrown them out or boxed them up. Just left them as I had, my coat hanging behind the bedroom door, my shoes lined up neatly beneath the bench, my half-used face cream still on the bathroom shelf. The apartment held the shape of me without the presence. It was unsettling. I moved quickly, trying not to let memory slow me down. I pulled the empty suitcase from the closet, started folding clothes mechanically, sorting by instinct. Essentials only. I didn't want to take anything that reminded me of who I had been in this space, only what I needed to move forward. In the bedroom, I found a small stack of notes I had written to myself, reminders, lists, goals. One said, fix resume by Thursday. Another, buy almond milk. Check bank account. The handwriting felt like a stranger's. A woman who believed she was in control, that she just needed to stay organized to keep everything from slipping. I sat down on the edge of the bed with one of the notes in hand. For a second, I let myself feel it all, the exhaustion, the detachment, the slow erosion of a life I had built too carefully around someone else's comfort. I hadn't come here to cry. But a tear still rolled down my cheek before I could stop it. There was a soft sound in the hallway. A key in the door. I froze. He stepped in, not expecting to see me there, clearly surprised. He looked exactly the same, tall, tired, neat in that distant way. He paused in the doorway, scanning the room, then met my eyes. "I didn't think you'd still be here," he said. "I wanted to finish before you got back," I replied, my voice even. He nodded and stepped inside, setting his bag down without another word. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence stretching awkwardly between us. "I didn't touch anything," he said after a beat. "Figured you'd want to pack on your own." "Thank you." He moved toward the kitchen, leaving me in the room. I zipped the suitcase slowly, taking my time. I didn't want confrontation. I didn't even want explanation. Just closure. Something quiet and respectful. I carried the suitcase out into the living room and stopped when I saw him standing near the window. He didn't turn to look at me. "So," he said, his tone flat, "are you staying with him?" There it was. I didn't answer right away. I set the suitcase down gently and straightened my coat. "I'm staying somewhere that feels safe." He turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have," I said. I didn't leave because of him. I left because I couldn't stay. He nodded slowly, processing. "I didn't think you'd actually go. I thought it was just temporary. A fight. A message. I didn't leave to send a message. I left because I was invisible here." He looked down, his hands resting on the back of the chair. "I didn't know you felt that way." "I know," I said quietly. There was nothing more to say. I picked up the suitcase and walked to the door. As I opened it, he called after me, not loudly, but enough for me to hear. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." I turned slightly. "I'm not looking anymore. I'm building." Then I left. Back at the apartment, the landlord was outside, sweeping the steps. He looked up as I returned, gave a small nod of acknowledgement, but didn't ask how it went. I appreciated that more than he could know. Inside, I placed the suitcase in the corner and hung my coat on the hook by the door. I stood for a moment in the middle of the room, just breathing. Just allowing myself to feel the difference between then and now. That night, we didn't talk much. We shared a quiet dinner, washed the dishes side by side. I noticed the way he glanced at me occasionally, not with curiosity, but with a calm kind of awareness. The kind that doesn't seek to possess or define. Later, I sat in the chair by the window, reading. The lamplight glowed warm across the pages. I could hear him moving in the kitchen, then the sound of the faucet turning off. A door closed gently. We spent the night together. Not for escape. Not for comfort. But for presence. For two people, simply existing in the same space, finally unafraid to be seen. The light that filtered through the kitchen window the next morning was soft and gray, the kind that arrived without urgency, the kind that seemed to ask nothing of you. I moved quietly around the apartment, my footsteps light against the wooden floor. The room was still, and though I couldn't hear him stirring yet, I knew he was there, resting, breathing, existing in that quiet parallel space we'd both somehow grown used to. There was no need for words. None had been spoken when I rose from the bed, and none felt necessary now. That silence between us wasn't emptiness, it had form, texture. It allowed us both to breathe without performing. I made coffee. Slowly. Carefully. The familiar ritual grounded me, rinse the pot, scoop the grounds, wait for the sound of the first slow drip. Outside, the sky was still heavy with overcast clouds, and I wondered whether it might rain. I hoped it would. The kind of soft rain that muffled the city and made the world feel smaller, more manageable. As I sat with the mug between my hands, I reflected on the night before, not as a moment to define, but as one that had simply existed. There was no guilt resting on my shoulders. No grand narrative begging to be constructed. Just a softness that had emerged between two people, held quietly and without expectation. A knock at the door interrupted the stillness. A firm, measured rhythm. I stood, heart rising just slightly in my chest, unsure why I felt the tension. Perhaps it was the unnaturalness of someone knocking here, where life had been slow and insulated. I opened the door cautiously, expecting perhaps a neighbor or someone from the management company. Instead, it was her. Not someone I recognized by name, but her face was familiar. She lived in the building across the street. I had seen her before on her balcony, watering plants or bringing in laundry. Now she stood in front of me with sharp eyes and a kind of knowing tilt to her head. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice polite but measured. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was just wondering, are you the woman who used to live in apartment 3C? I paused. I was, yes. She gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. I figured. I saw you moving things out last week. I waited, unsure what she wanted from me. "I'm sorry if this is out of line," she continued, "but people talk. That building has thin walls. I've heard a few things." The air between us shifted, tightened. "I don't mean anything by it," she said quickly, reading my silence. "I just thought, you should know." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Whatever she thought she knew, it wasn't my concern. But something about her tone unsettled me, not because it held accusation, but because it carried something softer, almost like pity. After a few seconds, she gave a tight smile. "Anyway. Sorry to bother you." She turned and left without waiting for a reply. I closed the door slowly, stood still for a long moment. My hands tightened slightly around the handle. Not because of her, but because it reminded me that life wasn't sealed inside these four walls. That beyond this space, things continued. People noticed. Judged. Assumed. Even in silence, stories formed, whether I gave them voice or not. I carried that awareness with me for the rest of the day. At work, I focused on small tasks. Filing. Sorting. Labeling. The temp job was repetitive, but it gave me rhythm, and lately, rhythm felt like survival. I caught myself checking my phone a few times more than usual, not to look for messages, but just to feel connected to something. When I returned to the apartment that evening, he was fixing a drawer in the kitchen. The cabinet had been sticking, and I'd seen him tug at it twice before. Now he was crouched with a screwdriver, quiet in his focus. I watched him for a moment before placing my bag by the chair. "You didn't have to do that," I said. He glanced up. "I know." We shared dinner at the small table. There were no grand declarations, no attempts to dissect what had changed. But something had. I could feel it in the way we moved around each other, in the silence that now held weight instead of distance. After we finished eating, he placed the dishes in the sink and turned to me. "You okay?" he asked. I thought of the woman at the door. The way her voice had implied that my choices were public currency. "I saw someone today," I said. "From the old building. She thinks she knows things about me." He raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. "It's strange," I continued. "How quickly people form conclusions. How little they need to decide who you are." He nodded. "It's easier for them that way. Makes the world simpler." I exhaled slowly. I'm tired of being simplified. His gaze didn't waver. Then don't be. That night, I didn't sleep right away. I lay in bed with the window slightly open, the air cool against my skin. I listened to the occasional sound of footsteps outside, the distant hum of a car, a dog barking 2 streets away. My thoughts moved slowly, not like racing fears, but more like ripples, gentle, spreading, inevitable. I thought about who I had become in the past month. About the woman who had once feared silence, who had filled her days with obligations just to feel worthy of rest. That woman had unraveled. Not dramatically. Quietly. Layer by layer. Until there was no performance left. Just truth. I wasn't healed. I wasn't transformed. But I was aware. And that awareness changed everything. It meant I could no longer go back. Not to the version of myself who waited for approval. Not to the man who mistook distance for stability. Not to the place where I fit only because I made myself smaller. The next morning, I woke up early again. The apartment was quiet. Still. But this time, it didn't feel like a pause. It felt like a beginning. No fanfare. No grand decision. Just the quiet certainty that something was ending, and something else, something less defined, was ready to take its place. The sky broke open sometime before dawn, and rain drummed steadily against the windows. I woke to the soft, persistent rhythm, my eyes adjusting slowly to the dim light. For a moment, I didn't move. I just listened. There was something reassuring about the sound, constant, gentle, unapologetic. The kind of rain that didn't beg for attention but refused to be ignored. I pulled the blanket closer and let my thoughts drift. They didn't race like they used to. They didn't demand answers or catastrophize the hours ahead. They simply moved, like the water on the glass, sliding over questions, possibilities, the edges of things not yet resolved. By the time I stepped into the kitchen, the apartment was already warm with the smell of toast and coffee. He stood at the stove, humming quietly to himself, barefoot and half distracted. He turned slightly when he heard me and offered a quiet good morning without turning it into something ceremonial. We ate in silence, our movements familiar, practiced. 2 people not trying to impress each other, just existing in the same space with a kind of quiet comfort. I noticed how he handed me the jar of jam without asking, how I poured his second cup of coffee before he reached for it. Small things. Simple. But they told stories. After breakfast, I bundled into my coat and stepped outside. The rain was lighter now, more of a mist, soft against my face as I walked. I didn't have a destination. I just needed to move, to feel the air and remind myself that I wasn't confined to any one version of my life. I wandered past the shops, past the bakery I had once avoided because it reminded me of all the things I couldn't afford. Now I stepped inside. I didn't buy anything. I just stood for a moment, letting the warmth of cinnamon and fresh bread wrap around me like a familiar voice. I watched the woman behind the counter smile at an older man, watched their brief exchange, hands brushing, eyes softening. Then I stepped back out into the gray. I made my way toward the neighborhood library. It was small, unassuming, tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered florist. Inside, it smelled of paper and dust and quiet ambition. I moved through the shelves with no real purpose, running my fingers along spines, letting titles whisper their own little invitations. I sat in a corner near the window with a book I didn't intend to read and just watched the world pass. People with umbrellas, people without. Children stomping through puddles, their parents tugging them along. Everyone moving, everyone wrapped in their own moments, their own storms. Back at the apartment, I toweled off my coat and placed it carefully on the hook. The warmth of the space met me at the threshold, and I breathed it in slowly. It didn't feel like home in the traditional sense. But it felt like mine. In a way that mattered more. I found him on the balcony, a small cup in his hand, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the street. I stood beside him, the air damp and cool against our skin. We didn't speak. The city spoke for us, the soft whir of passing cars, the occasional bark of a distant dog, the rhythm of footsteps below. He handed me the cup. I took it, sipped without asking what was inside. Something herbal, earthy. Not sweet. But grounding. Later, we worked together on small things. He fixed a drawer that had been sticking again. I reorganized the kitchen shelves. We moved through the apartment not as guests but as people who understood the language of shared space. It was a dance without choreography, each step learned through repetition and attention. In the late afternoon, I received a message. A simple one, from a woman I had known through work, back before everything shifted. Asterisk, saw your resume again. Are you still looking? We may have something. Part-time, but stable. Let me know. Asterisk. I stared at it for a while, unsure how I felt. Grateful, of course. But also hesitant. Not because I didn't want the job, but because it meant stepping back into the world, into routine, into the expectation of productivity. I wasn't afraid. But I wasn't eager either. I responded with a simple yes, thank you. Then I closed the laptop and sat for a long while, letting the implications settle. That night, as we washed dishes together, he looked at me briefly and asked, "Do you miss it?" "Miss what?" I said. "That life. The old one." I didn't answer immediately. I wiped my hands on a towel and leaned against the counter. "Parts of it," I said eventually. "Not the noise. Not the pretending. But the clarity. The structure. Knowing where I was supposed to be." He nodded. "That makes sense. Do you think that means I should go back?" I asked. He looked at me with the same quiet expression he always wore, calm, sure, unrushed. "I think you should go forward. Whatever that looks like." It wasn't advice. It wasn't guidance. It was just a truth offered plainly, with no expectation that I'd take it or not. I went to bed early that night. The rain had returned, tapping gently against the windows, a rhythm I had come to welcome. I lay awake for a while, watching the ceiling, letting my body sink into the weight of the day. I thought of everything I had carried, fear, guilt, confusion, and how slowly those weights had shifted. They were still there, yes, but they no longer anchored me. They simply reminded me of what I'd survived. I thought of the apartment I left, the man I walked away from, the version of myself who once thought being needed was the same as being loved. I thought of the soft click of his mug against mine, the way he didn't ask for answers, only offered space. And I thought of the woman I was becoming, one quiet, steady morning at a time. Not fixed. Not finished. But no longer afraid of beginning again. The first sunlight in days cut through the clouds like a slow exhale. It spilled across the wooden floor, softening the corners of the room, brushing the kitchen counter with a glow that made everything feel freshly opened. I stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching the neighborhood wake up. Children passed with backpacks swinging at their sides. A man jogged by, earbuds and breath visible in the morning air. The world outside was doing what it always did, moving forward. And I was finally ready to move with it. I had accepted the job. Part-time. Not glamorous. But stable. It would be enough. Enough to cover the essentials, enough to start thinking about what came next. I hadn't made a big announcement about it. I had simply told him the evening I got the final confirmation. He'd smiled, one of those small, quiet smiles that meant more than words, and said, "Sounds like a good step." That was it. No advice. No questions. Just presence. The apartment felt different that morning. Not in any dramatic way, but in the subtle shifts I hadn't noticed at first. My bag on the chair by the door instead of the floor, my books stacked in the corner by the lamp, my rhythm now part of the space. I was no longer a guest. And I wasn't just in transition anymore. I was building. I made breakfast without thinking, eggs, toast, fruit on the side. I wrapped his portion in foil and left it on the counter before I left, knowing he'd eat when he came in from morning rounds. It wasn't a routine born out of obligation. It was simple care. A way of saying I see you without saying anything at all. As I stepped outside, the air was brisk but not biting. The light coat I wore was enough. The street was alive with quiet movement. It felt good to have a place to go, a purpose, even a small one. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about claiming space, my own space. Work passed quickly. The office was warm, cluttered, filled with the quiet hum of printers and low conversation. The people there didn't know my story, and I didn't feel the need to tell it. I was just another woman returning to work, trying to find her rhythm. There was freedom in that. During my lunch break, I stepped outside and found a bench near the corner. I watched the cars, sipped from a small thermos, and let myself settle into the moment. My phone buzzed, an appointment reminder, nothing urgent, and I tucked it away again. I thought about the past few weeks. The unraveling. The unexpected. The quiet rebuilding. I didn't feel triumphant. But I didn't feel lost either. And that, to me, was progress. When I returned to the apartment that evening, the lights were off, but the space felt warm with familiarity. He wasn't home yet. I slipped off my shoes, set down my things, and changed into something soft and warm. I moved slowly, giving myself time to feel the shift in atmosphere. A small note sat on the table. 4 words, written in his familiar hand. Dinner later. Come hungry. I smiled without thinking. The hours passed gently. I read for a while, watered the plants near the window, folded laundry with a kind of meditative ease. When he returned, carrying takeout from a place we'd both mentioned once in passing, we ate in the living room, the food warm and simple, the air between us easy. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't label what we were. There was no need. Whatever it was had already taken shape, slowly, organically. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. After we cleaned up, I stood by the window again, looking out over the street as night folded in. The lights flickered on in the building across the way. The sky turned deep blue, almost violet. The city quieted into its usual hum. He came to stand beside me, not close, not far. We looked out together. I've been thinking, I said after a long stretch of silence, about getting my own place. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask why. He just waited. Not because I want to leave, I continued, but because I think it's time I learned to stand on my own again. On solid ground. He nodded once, slowly. That makes sense. It doesn't mean I want to disappear. I know. We stayed there a little longer, watching the world turn. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was filled with understanding. Over the next week, I made inquiries. I looked at small studios, modest spaces within walking distance from work. I wasn't in a rush. I was deliberate, choosing not just a roof, but a space that felt like a continuation of everything I'd begun to reclaim. A place where I could sit with myself and not feel like something was missing. When I finally signed the lease, it felt less like a finish line and more like a doorway. Not to something entirely new, but but to something entirely mine. I moved in on a Saturday. A small caravan of boxes, most of them filled with basics. Books. Clothes. A few dishes. I didn't take much. I didn't need to. The apartment was bare when I stepped inside, but it didn't feel empty. It felt open. Possible. He helped carry things up the stairs. We didn't say much. There was no big goodbye. Just a look shared between two people who had walked through something together. When he left, he didn't linger. He said, "Call if you need anything." And I said, "I will." That night, I sat on the floor of my new apartment with a cup of tea and no furniture. The windows were open, and the air was cool. I didn't feel alone. I felt whole. Later, I wrote a note in my journal. Just one line. I'm no longer afraid of being the only one in the room. And that was enough. Because this wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of one I chose. On my own terms. In my own voice. And this time, I wasn't writing for anyone else.